The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the war-torn streets of New London. Once a symbol of human achievement, the city was now a crumbling reminder of the destruction that had come with the alien invasion. The streets were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of distant explosions. The air was thick with smoke, and the once proud skyline of the city had been reduced to jagged ruins. The only survivors were the soldiers, hiding in the shattered remnants of buildings, waiting for the inevitable end. The alien forces had surrounded them. There was no way out, no chance for escape. Humanity's last hope seemed to be fading. Sarah stood at the edge of a broken building, staring out at the enemy forces. She could see their ships in the sky, dark and menacing. Thousands of alien soldiers marched across the ground, their sleek armor glinting in the dim light. There was no question about it. They were closing in. The final assault was imminent. Sarah was the commander of a small group of soldiers. She had led them through countless battles, each one more desperate than the last. But this was different. The aliens were stronger, faster, and more ruthless than any enemy they had ever faced. It was clear that they weren't just trying to conquer Earth. They were trying to destroy it completely. The human forces had fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Most of the world's major cities had already fallen. New London was the last holdout. Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of her rifle. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But every plan she came up with seemed hopeless. The city was surrounded on all sides. There was nowhere to run. The civilians had already been evacuated to safe zones, but the soldiers had to stay and make a final stand. That was their duty. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were doomed. "We can't hold out much longer, Sarah," a voice said behind her. It was Lieutenant Mark, her second in command. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face hardened by months of war. He stepped up beside her, his eyes scanning the alien forces. "The supplies are running low. The men are getting restless. We need a plan. Something. Anything." Sarah didn't answer at first. She didn't have a plan. She had been hoping for a miracle, but miracles didn't happen in wars like this. The world had been at peace for so long, and now, it seemed, humanity had forgotten how to fight. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many people were relying on her. "I know," she said finally, her voice low. "But we can't just surrender. Not after everything we've been through." Mark nodded grimly. "I know, but we have to face facts. The enemy is here, and they won't stop until we're all dead." Sarah's heart sank. She had seen the devastation the aliens had left in their wake. Cities reduced to ashes. Entire populations wiped out in a single strike. There was no mercy in their eyes, but she refused to give in to fear. She couldn't. Not when her team was depending on her. She turned back toward the building, her mind racing. There had to be something they could do. Some way to slow down the alien advance, to give the people of Earth a fighting chance. She couldn't just give up. Not now. "Sarah," Mark said again, his voice urgent. "There's something you need to see. A transmission just came in. It's from the last remaining scientists. They say they found something. A weapon. Something that could turn the tide of the war." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A weapon? Could this be the hope they had been waiting for? "Where are they?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "They're at a facility just outside the city," Mark explained. "But we don't know if they've completed it yet. The aliens have already started their final assault. We need to get to them. Fast." Sarah's mind raced. If the scientists had really discovered a weapon that could stop the aliens, it was their only chance. She couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. "Gather the team," she said quickly. "We're moving out. We have to reach that facility before it's too late." Mark gave a sharp nod and turned to gather the soldiers. Within minutes, Sarah's team was ready to move. They were a small group, no more than 20 soldiers. But they were experienced and determined. They had fought through hell to get this far, and they weren't about to give up now. The road ahead would be dangerous. The aliens were everywhere, their ships hovering ominously above the city, their troops marching through the streets. But Sarah knew they had no choice. If they didn't act now, humanity would be lost forever. They moved through the broken streets, keeping to the shadows as they advanced. The city was a maze of wreckage, with crumbling buildings and abandoned vehicles scattered everywhere. The once bustling metropolis had turned into a ghost town. The only sounds were the distant roars of alien war machines and the occasional crackle of static on their comms. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the air grew colder. The alien forces had set up barricades, blocking all major roads. But Sarah and her team were used to this kind of situation. They knew how to navigate through the ruins, avoiding detection as much as possible. Still, every step they took felt like a gamble. One wrong move, and they would be caught in the open. The aliens had eyes everywhere. "We're getting close," Sarah whispered, glancing at her watch. They were running out of time. The transmission from the scientists had been vague, and they had no idea how far along the weapon was in its development. It could be their only hope, but they had to reach it before the aliens destroyed it. They reached the facility just as the first wave of alien ships began to descend. The sound of their engines filled the air, drowning out everything else. Sarah's heart raced. They had to get inside, now. The team sprinted toward the entrance, their boots pounding against the cracked pavement. Just as they reached the door, an explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The alien forces had launched an attack on the facility. It was now or never. "Go, go, go," Sarah shouted, pushing her team forward. They burst through the door, finding themselves in a large, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with shattered glass and damaged equipment, but they could see the glowing lights of the main laboratory up ahead. The scientists were inside, but so were the aliens. The team moved quickly, taking cover behind a row of overturned tables. The sounds of alien footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sarah motioned for her team to stay silent, holding her breath as the enemy drew closer. The tension was unbearable. If they were caught now, they would never make it out alive. They waited in the shadows, the minutes feeling like hours. The aliens passed by, unaware of their presence. Sarah exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. They had made it this far. Now they just had to get to the scientists. With one last burst of speed, the team reached the laboratory door. Sarah slammed her fist against the control panel, and the door hissed open. Inside, a group of scientists were huddled around a massive machine, working frantically. One of them, a woman with short, silver hair, looked up in surprise. "You made it," she said, relief flooding her face. "We didn't think anyone would get through." "We're here to help," Sarah said quickly. "But you need to tell me, what's the status of the weapon?" The scientist's face darkened. "It's not finished. We're close, but it needs more time. Time we don't have." Sarah's stomach tightened. Time was the one thing they didn't have. The alien forces were closing in. If they didn't act now, it would all be over. "We'll buy you that time," she said, her voice firm. "Just finish it. We'll hold them off as long as we can." The scientist nodded, already turning back to the machine. Sarah looked at her team. They were all counting on her. She couldn't afford to fail. With a deep breath, Sarah picked up her rifle and moved into position. She would fight to the very end, no matter the cost. For humanity. For Earth. And as the sound of alien ships filled the air once more, Sarah knew that this was the last stand. But maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't finished yet. This part introduces a suspenseful and emotional moment as the characters prepare for a dangerous mission, with hope for a possible weapon and the looming alien threat. The tension in the air was thick as Sarah and her team gathered in the makeshift command center inside the lab. They had managed to get inside the facility just in time, but the alien forces weren't far behind. The sound of distant explosions rumbled through the building as Sarah stood beside the scientist who had been working on the weapon. "We're almost there," the scientist said, her voice tight with stress. "But I need more time to calibrate the final component. Without it, the weapon won't work." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. The enemy was closing in, and time was running out. Every second felt like an eternity. "How much time do you need?" "I can't say for sure," the scientist replied. "Maybe an hour, maybe less, but we can't risk being discovered before then. The aliens could be on top of us any minute." Sarah turned to Mark, who had been standing silently at her side, his face grim. "Can we hold them off for that long?" she asked. Mark's eyes narrowed as he thought for a moment. "We'll have to. If we let them get any closer, we won't have a chance. We need to set up a perimeter, keep them back while the weapon finishes." She could see the doubt in his eyes, but she also saw the determination. Mark wasn't one to give up easily. Sarah looked around at her team. The soldiers were weary, tired from months of fighting, but their resolve was unwavering. They were ready to give everything to save what was left of Earth. "We can do this," Sarah said firmly. "We hold this position. We buy them the time they need, no matter what." The team nodded, some of them exchanging uneasy glances, but they trusted Sarah. They had been through too much together to turn back now. They knew what was at stake. Humanity's survival rested on the success of this weapon. Sarah and Mark quickly gathered the team to assign positions. They couldn't afford to be careless. The alien forces were methodical in their attacks, and Sarah knew they would come for the facility with everything they had. The aliens had already wiped out most of the human forces, and they weren't going to let the last remaining resistance stand in their way. "Listen up," Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the low hum of the lab. "We've got one shot at this. We set up our defenses here and here." She pointed to the map on the wall. "And we hold this line. We can't let the aliens get any closer. Stay sharp. Stay focused. We fight until the weapon is ready." The soldiers moved quickly, taking their positions around the facility. Sarah watched them work, her mind still racing. She had been through countless battles, but this one felt different. They were cornered, with no way out, and the stakes were higher than ever before. She could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her, but she couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. Not in front of her team. Mark stood beside her, watching the soldiers prepare for the worst. "You think it'll work?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't hesitate. "It has to." They both knew that this was humanity's last chance. If the weapon didn't work, there was no backup plan. They would either defeat the aliens or be wiped out completely. The first wave of alien forces arrived sooner than they expected. The sound of their ships descending from the sky was deafening, shaking the ground beneath them. Sarah's heart raced as she motioned for her team to take cover. The aliens were fast. They had advanced technology, and they didn't hesitate to use it. "Get ready," Sarah shouted, gripping her rifle tightly. "They're coming." The soldiers settled into their positions, weapons raised, eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The facility was surrounded on all sides with little cover, but they had no choice. They had to hold their ground. Then they saw them. The alien troops emerged from the shadows, their sleek, armored bodies almost blending in with the night. They were terrifying in their precision, moving as one unit, their weapons already trained on the human defenders. Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle. This was it. The battle for humanity's survival. The first shots rang out, a burst of alien energy weapons cutting through the air. Sarah and her team fired back, the sound of gunfire echoing across the battlefield. But it was clear that the aliens were prepared. They didn't falter, didn't hesitate. They simply advanced, relentlessly pushing forward. "Keep them back," Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She could see her soldiers firing, but the aliens seemed to be getting closer with each passing second. The energy blasts from the alien weapons tore through the walls and the ground, creating explosions that sent shrapnel flying. Mark was at her side, firing his weapon, shouting orders to the other soldiers. He moved with purpose, never wavering. He was a seasoned fighter, But even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. They were losing ground. "We need more time," Sarah shouted over the gunfire. "Just hold on a little longer." But the alien forces were relentless. Every time they pushed the humans back, more troops arrived, their numbers growing exponentially. It was clear that the aliens had no intention of letting them escape. They were closing in. As Sarah ducked behind cover, she could see the lab in the distance, the scientists still working feverishly on the weapon. She couldn't afford to take her eyes off the battle, but every part of her mind was focused on them. If they didn't finish the weapon soon, they would all be dead. The aliens would destroy the lab, and everything would be over. The seconds felt like hours. The sounds of the battle grew louder, the alien forces pushing forward relentlessly. The soldiers were doing their best to hold the line, but the odds were stacked against them. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the aliens advancing, their weapons lighting up the night. "Sarah," Mark shouted, pulling her out of her thoughts. He was crouched behind a fallen wall, firing his weapon at an approaching alien soldier. "They're flanking us from the east." Sarah's eyes darted to the left, where a group of aliens were advancing. They were moving in from the side, trying to encircle the facility. She cursed under her breath. "Mark, we need to fall back," she yelled. "Fall back to the inner perimeter. Now." The soldiers began to retreat, covering each other as they moved. The alien forces closed in, but Sarah could see the faint light of hope flickering in the distance. The scientists were still working on the weapon. It wasn't ready yet, but it was their only hope. They made their way to the inner perimeter, regrouping behind more solid cover. The aliens were relentless, pushing closer, but the human soldiers held their ground. They weren't going to let the aliens take this last chance from them. "We're running out of time," Mark said, his voice tense. "We're not giving up," Sarah replied, her voice filled with determination. "Not until that weapon is ready." The battle continued, each moment feeling like it might be the last. The soldiers fought with everything they had, but the alien forces were too strong. They had to hold on until the weapon was ready. It was their only hope. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to wonder, would the weapon be ready in time? Would they be able to hold the line long enough to see it finished? In the midst of the chaos, Sarah's mind kept coming back to one thought. Humanity's survival depended on this weapon. If it didn't work, if they didn't survive this battle, Earth would fall, and there would be no coming back from that. The battle raged on, with Sarah and her team pushing back against the relentless alien forces. The walls of the facility were shaking from the force of the explosions, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. The soldiers had dug in, taking cover wherever they could, but the aliens weren't letting up. Every moment felt like a lifetime, and the strain of holding the line was beginning to show. "Keep firing," Sarah shouted, peering through the smoke and dust to see the alien forces advancing. Her team was doing their best, but the pressure was mounting. The aliens seemed to be everywhere, their numbers overwhelming. Sarah could feel the sweat dripping down her face as she fired her rifle, taking down one alien after another. But for everyone she killed, there were two more coming. "We need reinforcements," Mark called out, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He was crouched behind a crumbling wall, firing into the enemy lines. "We can't hold this position much longer." Sarah clenched her jaw. They were doing everything they could, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The aliens were well coordinated, their attacks precise and devastating. It was only a matter of time before they broke through. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and a series of sharp, bright flashes lit up the sky. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she saw the alien warships in the sky above them. They had just dropped reinforcements. The battle was about to get even worse. "We're surrounded," one of the soldiers shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Stay calm," Sarah ordered, trying to keep her voice steady. "We hold this line. We can't let them get any closer to the lab." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see the situation slipping out of their control. The soldiers were exhausted, their ammunition running low, and the aliens were closing in on all sides. The lab was the last hope for humanity, but if they couldn't protect it, the weapon would never be completed. As Sarah moved from cover to cover, directing the soldiers and keeping the aliens at bay, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fight felt different. There was a sense of betrayal in the air. Something wasn't right. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, she saw it. One of her own soldiers, Corporal Jensen, was acting strangely. Sarah had known Jensen since the beginning of the war. He was a good soldier, loyal, dependable. But now, as she watched him from across the battlefield, he was behaving differently. He wasn't fighting the aliens. Instead, he was moving toward the back of the facility, away from the main fight. Sarah's instincts flared. Something was wrong. She moved quickly, signaling to Mark to cover her as she approached Jensen. The chaos of the battlefield made it difficult to hear her own footsteps, but she was sure she was being careful. Her eyes locked onto Jensen as he moved behind one of the destroyed vehicles. "Jensen," Sarah called, her voice sharp. The corporal froze, his back to her. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned, his face pale and drawn. His eyes flickered nervously as he saw Sarah approaching. "Commander," he said, his voice tight. "I was just." "You were just what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. "You're supposed to be helping us hold the line, not running off to God knows where." Jensen shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching at his sides. I needed to get something important." Sarah narrowed her eyes. The situation was dire, and there was no time for games. She moved closer to him, her eyes searching his face. There was something in his expression, a flicker of guilt, that sent a chill down her spine. "What is it, Jensen?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with suspicion. "What are you really doing?" Jensen's gaze dropped to the ground. For a moment, he was silent. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. "I'm sorry, Commander," he said quietly. "I never wanted to betray you. But I had no choice." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Betrayal. The word hung in the air between them, and she felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a heavy burden. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice now shaking with a mix of confusion and anger. "What do you mean you had no choice?" Jensen's eyes darted around, and he took a step closer to Sarah. "I had to make a deal with them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The aliens, they promised me something. They promised me I could survive, that they would spare me. I thought I could live. I thought I could save myself." The world seemed to stop for a moment as Sarah processed his words. Betrayal. One of her own had made a deal with the enemy, and now the rest of them were paying the price. "Jensen, you." Sarah stopped herself, her throat tight with fury. "You sold us out." "I didn't want to," Jensen protested, his voice rising. "But I was scared. I thought." "Enough," Sarah snapped. "You're a traitor. You've put all of us in danger. How could you do this?" Jensen's face twisted with guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought it was the only way." The anger in Sarah's chest flared, but she quickly suppressed it. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. They needed to fix this. "Now, where are they?" she asked, her voice cold. "Where are the aliens you made a deal with?" Jensen hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously. "They're coming. They're going to attack from the rear. They're going to overwhelm the perimeter. I tried to stop it, but they're already on their way." Sarah felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. The traitor had set them up. She had trusted Jensen, relied on him, and now he had put them all in jeopardy. The aliens were already at their backs, and there was no time to prepare. She turned on her heel, her mind racing. "Mark," she shouted, her voice sharp. We've got a breach at the rear. Get the men back there. Now." Mark appeared at her side almost instantly, his face filled with confusion. "What's going on?" "Jensen betrayed us," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "The aliens are attacking from the rear. We need to fortify the position. Now." Mark's eyes widened as he took in the gravity of the situation. "Understood. We'll move fast." The team quickly mobilized, heading to the rear of the facility to prepare for the incoming alien assault. Sarah stayed close to Jensen, her fury simmering beneath the surface. She couldn't believe it. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, but she couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now. Jensen trailed behind her, his face pale and nervous. "I can help," he said, his voice pleading. "I can make it right. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." Sarah said nothing as they moved. She didn't trust him anymore. But they didn't have a choice. They needed every able body they could get. When they reached the rear of the facility, the alien forces were already advancing. The first wave of troops emerged from the shadows, their weapons raised, and the battle began again. Sarah's mind was focused on the enemy, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't stop thinking about Jensen's betrayal. The aliens were overwhelming them, pushing them back with their superior numbers and firepower. The team fought with everything they had, but Sarah knew it wouldn't be enough. Not unless the weapon was finished, not unless they could hold on just a little longer. As she fired at the approaching aliens, Sarah caught sight of Jensen again, his hands trembling as he aimed his weapon. He was trying to help, but she could see the fear in his eyes. The fear of being caught. The fear of facing the consequences of his actions. The battle was far from over, and the odds were stacked against them. But Sarah wouldn't give up. She couldn't. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. This part delves into the tension of betrayal, as Sarah faces the realization that one of her own soldiers, Jensen, has turned on them by making a deal with the aliens. The suspense increases as they prepare for the alien forces to attack from behind, and the trust between Sarah and her team begins to crack. The sound of gunfire was deafening as Sarah fought with everything she had to hold her ground. The rear of the facility was under attack, and the alien forces were closing in with a terrifying precision. Her soldiers were fighting valiantly, but the betrayal had shaken them to their core. Jensen's treachery had planted a seed of doubt, and now, the trust that had once been so strong was fraying at the edges. Sarah kept her focus on the battle. They had no time to dwell on what had happened. The aliens were here, and humanity's last chance for survival lay in the hands of the weapon being built deep within the facility. Mark was beside her, firing his weapon with the practiced ease of a soldier who had seen far too many battles. His face was set in grim determination, but even he couldn't hide the toll the betrayal had taken on him. "We're losing ground," he said, barely audible over the explosions. "They're everywhere." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the pressure mounting. They were running out of time. The weapon was still not ready, and the aliens were advancing faster than they could hold them off. "Hold the line," she yelled, stepping forward to take a shot at one of the alien soldiers advancing on their position. "Don't give an inch." Her soldiers responded, but she could see the exhaustion in their eyes. They were holding on by sheer willpower. Sarah's mind raced as she scanned the battlefield. It was clear they couldn't keep this up for much longer. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Sarah saw the scientist who had been working on the weapon. Dr. Leela Hawk was at the far end of the facility, frantically working at a console, her hands moving with urgency. The lad was protected by a small team of soldiers, but even they were starting to falter under the pressure of the alien onslaught. "Leela," Sarah shouted, spotting the scientist over the gunfire. "How much longer?" Leela didn't turn, but Sarah could see the sweat pouring down her face. "It's almost there," she called back. "Just a few more minutes." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A few more minutes. They didn't have that long. She glanced at Mark, and they shared a look of grim understanding. "Mark, We need to hold them off for just a little longer, Sarah said, her voice tight. We don't have any other choice. I know, he replied, his voice strained. But they're too strong. We can't keep this up forever. The aliens were relentless. The battle felt like it would never end, and each minute that passed made it harder to keep the hope alive. Sarah's soldiers were exhausted, their ammunition running low. The alien forces had broken through several lines of defense, and now they were just meters away from the lab. Sarah's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. She couldn't let the aliens win. Not after everything they had fought for. They had come so far, sacrificed so much. Humanity's last hope couldn't be crushed just when they were so close to victory. Without thinking, Sarah turned to Jensen, who had been fighting by her side, his face pale and filled with fear. Despite his betrayal, they needed every hand they could get, and she had no time to deal with him now. She needed to focus on survival. Jensen, she barked, get over to that flank. We need every position covered. He didn't hesitate, though Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had betrayed them, and now he was fighting to redeem himself. But Sarah couldn't afford to think about that. There was no room for weakness. Not now. Jensen ran off to the flank, joining a small group of soldiers. Sarah turned back to the battle, keeping her rifle trained on the advancing aliens. The enemy was getting closer, their advanced technology giving them an edge. Every shot they fired seemed to be more accurate, more deadly. Her team was barely holding on. And then something happened that Sarah couldn't have predicted. A massive explosion rocked the ground beneath her feet, sending a shockwave that knocked her to the ground. The force of it was overwhelming, and Sarah felt her vision blur as she struggled to stay conscious. Her ears rang, and she could taste blood in her mouth. When she regained her bearings, she saw that the explosion had come from within the facility, a breach in the lab. No, she gasped, scrambling to her feet. Her heart pounded in her chest. Leela. She didn't wait for Mark's response. Sarah sprinted toward the lab, ignoring the sounds of the battle behind her. She had to get to Leela. She had to make sure the weapon was finished, or they were all dead. As she entered the lab, she found Leela on the floor, a look of shock on her face. The walls were crumbling, and the console was sparking, smoke rising from the damaged equipment. The scientist was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, but she was still conscious. Leela, Sarah shouted, kneeling beside her. What happened? It's not ready, Leela whispered, her voice trembling. The alien attack. They hit the main generator. I tried to finish it, but the power surge, it stopped everything. Sarah's heart sank. They were so close. The weapon was so close to being finished, but now it was broken. It would take too long to repair it. The aliens were already here, and there was no way they could finish it in time. But then something sparked in Sarah's mind, something she hadn't considered before. Is there any other way? Sarah asked, her voice urgent. Can we use what we have left, even if it's incomplete? Leela looked up at her, her eyes wide with panic. You don't understand. The weapon, it's only half finished. It's too unstable. Sarah's mind raced. Half finished or not, they didn't have time to fix it. But if they didn't try, they were doomed. Can it work? Sarah asked, pressing harder. Can it fire, even for a short time? Can we use it to stop them? Leela hesitated, looking at the damaged console and the wreckage around them. Finally, she nodded, a look of reluctant understanding on her face. I can try, she said, but it won't be perfect. It's risky. Sarah didn't hesitate. Do it. Leela scrambled to the console, pulling wires together and trying to stabilize the power. The lad was shaking, the alien forces closing in, but Leela worked as fast as she could. Every second felt like an eternity. Outside, the alien forces were advancing, their weapons lighting up the night sky. Sarah could hear the screams of her soldiers as they fought to hold them back, but their voices were growing fainter. The aliens were winning. No more time. Sarah shouted, her voice desperate. "We need that weapon now." "I'm almost there," Leela called back, her voice strained. The sound of explosions grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled with each blast. The walls were starting to collapse, and Sarah could feel the heat from the explosions outside. But she didn't move. She couldn't. She was waiting for Leela. And then, with a sudden hum, the weapon came to life. The console lit up, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. "It's ready," Leela said, barely able to speak over the noise of the battle. "Now, Leela," Sarah commanded. "Now." Leela pressed a final button, and the weapon fired. The blast was like nothing Sarah had ever experienced. A massive wave of energy shot out from the lab, engulfing the alien forces outside. The shockwave knocked Sarah off her feet, but she didn't care. She could hear the alien screams, the sound of their ships disintegrating in the air. It was working. The weapon, incomplete and unstable, had worked. For one brief, glorious moment, it had turned the tide. But as Sarah lay there, trying to catch her breath, she knew it wasn't over. The aliens were still alive, and the battle was far from finished. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. This part introduces the crucial moment where the incomplete weapon is activated, providing a ray of hope amid the chaos. But even as the tide begins to turn, Sarah knows the war is far from over. The suspense and tension continue to build as they fight against time and alien forces.